I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Marianne Carr. A little preamble as we're waiting for the people to come back in this room. In 1973, we had the energy crisis. In the next couple of years, Congress was very busy. They did a lot of things right. There's one thing they did, in my opinion, wrong. And in the panic of the embargo on oil, they said, we should protect ourselves by making it impossible to export crude oil from the United States. And so the US made it illegal, except in very limited circumstances, to export crude oil. We could export products, that's okay, just not the crude oil. This came in as a coalition of the people who were legitimately worried about energy security. And there was a group of people who recognized that oil would then be transported in the United States using US bottoms, that is, ships that are owned and controlled by US, which are terribly much more expensive than foreign ships. And so there would be good things for the maritime industry. And this coalition seems to have protected that. It's only very recently has the ban been lifted. Many of us were surprised that the Republicans were able to get this through. But it was just lifted. And we've asked Marianne Carr to talk about the implications, what we're going to see as a result of that. Marianne Carr is chief economist of ConocoPhillips, been very involved in the debates, the discussions about opening up the opportunity to export oil. On a personal front, I've known Marianne for a large number of years, and we have one thing in common. We're both senior fellows of U.S. Association for Energy Economics, only I'm a lot more senior than she is. So on that, Marianne. And one last thing, this is a short session. So get your questions in quickly, because we will have 5 minutes for questions. So get them going now, because it's a short session.
It's a pleasure to be here talking to you today, and this has been a wonderful forum, and I've learned a lot over the last 2 days. So I'm going to talk about an issue near and dear to me, and everyone has to see my forward-looking SEC Safe Harbor slide. I'm sure you can all read this. So when I was first asked to do this, we actually hadn't had the ban lifted yet. So my subject became, why should we lift the ban, to what are the consequences of doing so? And on December 18th, it was a Christmas present, because I had been working on this personally for 2 years and have visited over 50 congressional offices talking about the rationale behind it. The ban was lifted, and I'm showing you the picture on the right of the tanker, the TOT, that left with the first US crude export on New Year's Eve, and I'm proud to say that it was our crude it left with. So what was the rationale for this? Well, first of all, as Jim was telling you, when this ban was put in place, the US production was in steep decline. We had the Arab oil embargo, and that was the context of it. But today we find ourselves in a very different scenario. We have abundant and resilient, and I'll talk more about the resilient in a second, supplies in the United States, and therefore we can afford to be an exporter. Also, there's tremendous economic and security benefits, which I'll come back to in a minute. But the basic rationale of why we really needed to export was the crude we produce in tight oil, or shale as you're used to hearing about it. It's a very impermeable reservoir, so the molecules that come out are very, very light. And it didn't match the refining system of the US. For 30 years, the US thought we were running out of crude oil, and particularly WTI, or light crude oil production. And therefore, refineries invested in heavy oil upgrading equipment so they could run the heavy crudes from Mexico and Canada. Well, lo and behold, after 30 years of this investment, suddenly we find this very large supply of very light crude that didn't match the U.S. refining capability. And yes, the U.S. refineries can take some, but often it requires a discount. You have to discount it because you have to run your refinery in a way it was not designed to be run. For example, you might have to cut your crude run rates, which is a very big economic decrement, or you might have to produce product that is of a lower value intermediate product because you don't have enough downstream processing capacity for something that light. So the bottom line was refiners said, yes, we can take it, but it was not economically possible for them to process it without seeing a very large domestic crude price discount. So that was the essence of the problem, because this discount made it impossible to invest in a lot of prospects. It's not only that, you have less cash flow to invest, and the economics of investing is lower if you have a $10 a barrel discount and rising, because that's what our future looked like before this happened. Some people say, well, it's a lower price environment. You don't need to export as much because there's less production. But I would argue that in a low price environment, even a $1 a barrel discount is going to knock out a lot of crude and make it uneconomic, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. Also, seasonally, when U.S. refineries go into turnaround, they take 1 to 2 million barrels a day of refining capacity off the market. And in the past, we would just reduce imports. But if the U.S. is an exporter, what do we do with that production when refineries go down for maintenance? Do we shut it in? So there was a seasonal problem, and I maintain that exports will probably occur seasonally during this refinery maintenance season when there's less demand for crude in the U.S. So big data has come to the oil and gas supply-demand analysis. I can now model, there's about 2,000 assets here of all of U.S. tight oil production, and I'm actually working on a new model by well. You can model supply from every single well in the United States and globally. So we have much better supply projections at our hands, given that we have this level of granularity of data. So what I'm showing you here is my forecast of what U.S. tight oil production would be at various prices, and I'm showing you that to point out how resilient U.S. production is, even in a fairly low price environment. At the current price we have in the $20 to $30 range, there's nothing in non-OPEC that's economic in terms of new production. So, that doesn't work, as you can see from this chart. In a $40 price environment, production goes into decline. But in a $50 price environment, and I'm assuming 100% reinvestment rate from our cash flow, when historically our industry has been investing 125% of our cash flow back into the ground. Obviously, that requires bringing on debt, which is no longer happening. But my point is, with conservative assumptions, I can see that at a $50 price environment, production, after going through a short period of decline, turns around and starts growing again. So not only do we have a lot of this, but it's actually one of the more economic things that companies like ours could invest in around the world, because it has a very short cycle time, which reduces risk and makes it more economic in terms of a net present value basis. But to get back to the former production growth trajectory, which was almost 1 million barrels a day per year, it would require a much higher price, about an $85 a barrel price. So what were the benefits of making this happen? It would lower consumer or gasoline and diesel prices. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive to you, but the fact is, because gasoline and oil products are traded globally, their prices are set internationally based on the international crude price. So if you, in fact, add more crude to the world supply, you lower the world crude price, which lowers global and U.S. gasoline prices. And I'll come back to this point. It was a very important point, and many studies, Brookings Institution, Resources for the Future, the U.S. Department of Energy, many studies looked at this and reached the exact same conclusion. The U.S. economic benefits and job creation is really big. I don't think most people realize how many jobs in the U.S. oil and gas industry has created. And it's not just in our industry, it's in a very large supply chain. For example, steel, materials, information technology, financial services, equipment, steel products. I mean, I can go on, sand from Minnesota. In fact, one study recently pointed out that for every job created in our industry, we create 3 jobs in our supply chain and 6 jobs in the global economy. The same study also pointed out that 1% of US GDP growth from 2008 to 2013 came because of US oil and gas industry investment. I mean, that's huge given that we've only been growing at about 2% a year. So this makes a big difference, and $10 a barrel and getting rid of that domestic crude discount would allow us to have a lot more investment, which is really the cause behind the big economic multiplier. We spend money, we spend it in the entire supply chain. We also would reduce the nation's oil import dependence, increasing government revenues, we generate a lot of tax revenues, and strengthening the US geopolitical position. You've heard about some of this over the last couple of days, but one of the big things is that we are adding a swath of crude supply from a very stable source, and something that's very resilient in terms of a price basis. So it's not going to disappear. I think the production most at risk now are the longer lead time, larger projects like big deep water projects. You'll see them deferred. We also, not only that, we could actually supply crude to people, to countries that actually are dependent on non-friendly governments like Eastern Europe and Russia, or people who want to diversify away from Iran. One of the reasons why US sanctions were effective is because the US was offering another crude supply source to the world. And finally, the whole concept of free trade is something that the US has been promoting for many years. And for us to take a visible position against trade, being the only OECD country that does not allow crude exports, really puts a dent in that sort of philosophy and integrity of US position. So as an economist, I can't get up here without showing you a supply curve. And this supply curve is of all of US oil supply, and it's lined up by production level, and I'm starting at 8.5 million barrels a day, so you're not seeing all of the existing production, which breaks even at a much lower price than this. And then you're seeing the cost of supply with a 10% discount rate on the left axis. And I'm showing you to make the point that in a low price environment, our ability to export and not have a domestic crude price discount, why it's so important. If you look at going from $100 to $80 a barrel at the far end of the curve, the steep portion of the curve, you only lose about 500,000 barrels a day of production. But now, if you go from a $60 to a $40 price environment, you suddenly see that over 1.5 million barrels a day are at risk because you're in a very relatively flat portion of the supply curve. So this makes actually a much bigger difference. Every dollar discount, you lose a lot more crude in this lower price environment because the world price is very close to where our break-even prices are in that price range. I want to say one other thing about security. If you look at how US tight oil production has already helped world energy stability, I'm showing you the cumulative effect of supply disruptions in the Middle East and North Africa on the left, and something happened to the bottom of this chart. I don't know what happened to it. But anyway, you can just see the top edge of what the cumulative growth in US tight oil production has been. And we've essentially offset all of that lost production by backing out imports. The problem is we've already backed those imports out. So we would have been less influential in the world market if we suddenly kept our borders shut and wouldn't allow exports. So I wanted to get back to the gasoline price question. And instead of showing you all the statistical analyses that have been done, I'm going to show you what I call an interocular regression. And what that means is I eyeball the data and look at the data, and the data makes sense to me. So on the left, what you see are spot gasoline prices without tax in the US, Gulf Coast, New York, Singapore, and Northwest Europe. And not surprisingly, they're all moving together. There are some aberrations, mostly due to weather, but they're quickly arbitraged away. That, to me, is market evidence that gasoline prices are being set internationally. The chart on the right is showing you just New York and Gulf Coast gasoline prices versus Brent, the North Sea crude, in that dark black line, and then WTI, the domestic crude, which is the dashed line. And if you look at that chart, you see that our domestic crude prices had completely disconnected from everything, from US consumer prices, from the world price. And so consumers in the US have not benefited at all from having this trapped crude. They're still paying the same international price. In fact, the only group that benefited are refiners who are buying this light crude at the trapped low domestic price and selling the products at the world price. So you can see why there was some refiners who were opposed to this. But I will talk next about why refiners still maintain a competitive advantage in the United States. First one is, if we have to export, it will cost $3 to $6 a barrel, depending on how far away you're going. And U.S. refiners don't have to pay that cost. The people who we're exporting to will have to pay at least a $3 a barrel higher cost if it's Europe, for example, which is where the East Coast of the United States views its refinery competition. Also, if you look at the chart on the upper left, U.S. gas prices, the Henry Hub price, is so much lower than European and the Asian LNG price that's refinery fuel. And refinery fuel is a big cost for refineries. So we have those two competitive advantages. And on the East Coast, it was the East Coast refiners who do use light crude, some of the few refiners left in the United States that still rely on light crude. They were particularly unhappy with allowing this crude to be exported. But they used to be very uneconomic before the shale revolution because there was a shortage of light crude in the world, and they were paying a lot of money for West African light crude to import. And I'm showing you an example of Bani, which is a West African crude, light crude, versus Maya, a Mexican heavy crude. And you can see they had to pay $15 a barrel more than what the US Gulf Coast refiners were paying for their crude. But comes the shale revolution and suddenly adding a new source of light supply in the world, you can see that we've brought it down to only an $8 extra differential. So while these refineries used to be uncompetitive, they now are competitive because of the whole change in the structure between light and heavy prices. So I wanted to talk specifically about what have we seen in the market since this happened. Well, this is showing you the WTI, the domestic crude, minus the Brent, or international crude. And historically, before the shale renaissance, you can see that domestic crude was priced $3, about $2 to $3 above the Brent price. This was because, one, WTI happens to be a better crude, higher product value, but also we were importing crude at the time, so we had to pay the $2.50 to $3 transportation costs from Europe to the United States. Then, when the shale revolution started, you can see the huge drop. There was suddenly a $15 a barrel discount on domestic crude. Initially, that was because we didn't have enough infrastructure to move it. By 2013, the infrastructure had been built. So then the discount became because refineries had taken as much of it as they could without requiring a domestic crude price discount to take any more of it. And so you can see what the futures curve for WTI and Brent looked like at the time. It was showing a $10 a barrel domestic crude discount. Now look at the red line, which is the current futures curve. And lo and behold, WTI is currently trading above Brent on most days. Now, not all of this is due to the lifting of the ban, although some of it clearly is. Some of it is due to the fact that our production is in decline now to the very low prices, and that will hopefully be reversed soon. But you can see that we don't get back to that $10 discount. We get back to a discount of $2 to $3, which makes sense because that's what it would cost if we were to export to Europe. So how much will we export? I know some people were worried about open the floodgates and it will all rush out. Well, that's really not true at all. You have to have prices be $3 to $6 a barrel higher somewhere else to be able to make it economic to export. So one study that we recently saw commissioned said that exports would be between 1 and 1.5 million barrels a day by 2020. And they're about 500,000 barrels a day today. In fact, I'm showing you what they look like today, and most of it's light crude with a bit of a condensate. If you look at 2020, a lot of the growth is going to be in light crude and not in condensate. And where is it going to go? It's most likely to go to the places that are closest because that minimizes the shipping costs and means your arb window for exporting will be open longer. So Latin America is probably the first one. Mexico has need of light crude, and actually sends the US the heavy crude. Europe is another place that, because the North Sea is also light crude, the refineries around Europe and Northwest Europe are used to running that type of crude. And when we exported that first cargo, it in fact did go to Europe. So let me stop here and summarize. Having free trade in crude has a tremendous amount of benefits in terms of it spurs investment or allows investment, both because we have the cash flow to invest and because more projects are made economic by not having that discount. The discount would have risen over time as production grew if it weren't for the fact that the ban has been lifted. We also don't believe consumers are going to be hurt. In fact, consumers should be helped, according to all the studies, with lower prices because we're adding another stable crude supply source to the world market, which is lowering the world crude price and lowering all consumer prices in the US and elsewhere. US refineries are likely to remain a competitive advantage over particularly their European counterparts, and that's the East Coast refineries versus Europe. And US crude exports are likely to be modest, relatively modest relative to our production, and are going to go to the places that are probably closest to the US to minimize shipping costs. So with that, I'll end and be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. I think 20 minutes was a shorter time than I anticipated it would be because we're already a minute over time.
Oh, dear.
So we're going to have to pull, we'll have one question. I'm going to violate the 1 minute rule and do these quick questions, but there's got to be quick answers. Are you mostly looking at swapping of different oil types or significant net oil exports? You mostly answered it, but do you want to expand
Well,
it?
before the export ban was lifted, the only way you can actually export was through a swap to either Canada or Mexico. And those swaps tended to be, you could do a light-heavy crude swap. And in fact, Mexico is sending heavy crude to the US, and they want to buy light crude from the US. But now that the ban is lifted, you're free to export the light crude to whatever market, has the highest value for it.
And the final question, will this make any difference on climate emissions, reduced or increased, or will it be a wash?
Well, I once heard a great speaker, Larry Summers, say that he doesn't see how it makes a difference to carbon emissions whether you're using US crude or foreign crude. But I will add to that, the US has the most stringent standards of production in the world. So I think an environmental community would probably prefer it to be US crude than some foreign crude that wasn't as careful about things like flaring and methane emissions.
Great. Well, thank you. We'll bring this to an end. Thank you.